Hello, and welcome back to part 3 of the chapter on the gastrointestinal tract. We had just finished off part 2, talking about some malabsorption issues. And we are going to continue again, related to the malabsorption. In order to absorb any of the macromolecules, the proteins, the lipids, the carbohydrates, we need to digest them first. So to put it in simpler terms, digestion means to cut up those larger macromolecules into the subunits, and the subunits we can absorb. We can bring those into the cells. If we cannot break them up, we can't digest them, we cannot absorb them. So let's now talk about the organ that helps us with this the most, and that is the pancreas. The pancreas works in a few different ways, and one of the ways it works is as an exocrine gland. Exocrine, usually we think of about that as like secreting to the outside. And this is a little bit confusing, but it's secreting onto an epithelial surface. And if you remember the tube that goes through us from mouth to anus, that's hollow tube. And what's in there is like being inside the hole of the donut. It's inside, but it's not really inside. So when this secretes onto the surface of the small intestine, it's secreting to the outside of us, if you will, onto an epithelial surface. And there are multiple safeguards against autodigestion, the pancreas like digesting itself with these enzymes. Spoiler alert, it still happens. But there are several mechanisms that kind of they don't work as well as they need to. So some of these safeguards are this: production of zymogens. This term means it's an enzyme, but it's not completely in its final shape. It's an enzyme precursor. Sometimes you'll hear these called proenzymes. It just means like they're gonna be enzymes, but they're not there yet. And then the pancreas packages these zymogens into granules, kind of little pods, in the interest of having it not digest the pancreatic gland cells. And on top of that, the pancreatic cells produce a protease inhibitor. Just in case any of these get activated, there's a mechanism to turn it off. So the way it's supposed to happen is the pancreatic enzymes are supposed to go into the gut lumen, that is the inside of the small intestine. Then they get cleaved, they get cut or activated by kinase. That's an enzyme that's going to activate something, and entero, meaning it's in the digestive system. It's in the cells of the digestive system. It's supposed to activate these enzymes, and the different enzymes digest different things. So the proteins, remember, proteins are made of amino acids, lots of different, the 20 different amino acids. And so the enzymes that digest those are called proteases, and there's a bunch of them, because the amino acids are shaped differently from each other. The different R groups are shaped differently. And so not the same pair of scissors will work between each of the different amino acids. And so that's why the different proteases are necessary. They're like different specialized scissors for cutting the different amino acids apart. Then carbohydrates are a lot simpler. They're just, mostly it's starch, and it's mostly glucose hooked together the same way every time. And so the enzymes that digest starches are amylase, and we make amylase in our mouth, salivary amylase, and the pancreas also makes it. So it's called pancreatic amylase, and it cuts up the sugars apart from each other. And then finally, the lipases. These are for digesting the lipids. So we have to cut those fatty acid tails apart from the glycerol molecule. And in addition to these enzymes, the pancreas is also making fluid that's rich in bicarbonate. And that is, again, to neutralize that very acidic stuff that's coming out of the stomach. And it's supposed to protect the duodenum, that very first part of the small intestine. Sometimes things go wrong and the pancreas is affected by these enzymes. And it leads to inflammation of the pancreas or pancreatitis. Acute pancreatitis can be caused by gallstones. Now, gallstones are structures in the gallbladder, which is associated with the liver, but we'll talk a little bit next week about how this happens. Excessive use of alcohol, again, can be irritating to the pancreas, and some drug reactions can lead to this problem. What happens is we're increasing inflammation and oxidant stress. Here's what's important, is we're destabilizing the zymogen granules, those things that have the enzyme precursors in them, that releases and activates the enzymes. The enzymes are going to start acting on whatever proteins available, whatever lipids are available, and whatever carbohydrates are available. But the most important part is the proteases. They're going to just start chopping up the cells. And so that's how these pancreatic cells get damaged and ultimately get killed. What do we need to deal with pancreatitis? If we're diagnosing, there's a blood test that we can do for those enzymes. So I mentioned there's amylases for digesting carbs, there's proteases for digesting proteins, and there's lipases for digesting lipids. We look for amylases and lipases because there are other proteases that you might find in the blood, but there's no reason that we should ever have amylases or lipases in the blood, except that they're leaking out of the pancreas. And it's leaking out because the pancreas is damaged. This is an extremely painful condition. And so of course, we manage the pain of the patient. It can proceed to critical illness. And having repeated episodes of acute pancreatitis makes the patient more likely to develop chronic pancreatitis. Let's go back to a disorder that we have talked about before, cystic fibrosis. Where we've dealt with it before has been with respirations. We talked about it first when we were talking about genetic disorders. And you actually, in your first case study question set, you had to deal with, what exactly is going wrong. And so it's coming back. So the CFTR transporter, that's the cystic fibrosis transmembrane. I don't remember what the R stands for. Anyway, that protein is defective and it's not moving the chloride properly. Well, the same consequences that we had in the lungs we're having now, because it's this transporters in the mucus producing cells. And so the mucus that's going to be made is going to be really thick and it's going to block the pancreatic ducts. So the enzymes are still being made inside the pancreas, here inside the pancreas, and it's supposed to be delivered through these ducts here into the duodenum. But these ducts get blocked in the pancreas and the stuff can't move. And it ends up becoming, the enzymes become activated inside the pancreas and it starts to digest the pancreas. Even if they don't get activated, you're still not getting them into the small intestine when you're supposed to get them. And so what ends up happening to these patients with cystic fibrosis is they have a limitation. They can eat just fine. They can eat the protein, they can eat the carbs, they can eat the lipids. They can't digest them because they don't have the enzymes getting to the gut at the right time. And so these patients have to take oral enzymes when they have their meals. This is going to be especially important during childhood, during the growth periods. Often our patients who are adults now, who survived a childhood with cystic fibrosis, they tend to be smaller than other members of their family. It doesn't make them miniature or anything, but they don't get to full grown as they could have been had they been able to get the nutrients that they needed when they were younger. Now there are some much better treatments for cystic fibrosis, or some of the kids who would have been smaller are catching up in their growth. And if you're interested about that, drop a question in the discussion board. But yeah, this is really important. So with somebody who has chronic pancreatitis, or they have cystic fibrosis and they're not able to get the enzymes in the right place, they have trouble growing during childhood, but then even in adulthood, they have trouble maintaining weight because they can't get all the nutrients out of the food that they need. So they're not able to maintain their muscle mass, for example. All right, principles of gut digestion and absorption. We've been over this. The nutrients get absorbed mostly in the small intestine and mostly in the duodenum and jejunum. And as we've gone over, this is reviewed in detail in that review video. The carbs get broken down to individual sugars called monosaccharides. Mostly it's glucose. Proteins get broken down to individual amino acids, 20 different ones. And the lipids are the kind of complicated story. There's different kinds of lipids. Triglycerides are the most common ones with the 3 fatty acid tails, and we have to take those fatty acid tails off. Then the phospholipids, there's 2 fatty acid tails and the phospho part. And to take these things apart. And then cholesterol esters, there's the cholesterol, that's that 4-ring structures. And then there's usually one fatty acid tail on that, and that has to get cut off. And then if you can cut these things right, that's the stuff that can be absorbed. That's the stuff that can be brought across into the cell. And I just went through that whole story. Dietary starch, carbs. The term hydrolysis, it means breaking down. Lysis, cutting or splitting, and hydro, it doesn't matter, but you needed a hydrogen and an oxygen and a hydrogen to split the thing apart. So the enzyme is amylase. The 2 sugar units get split apart by enzymes that are like in place in that brush border. And so, for example, sucrose, table sugar, that gets taken apart by sucrase, which is in the brush border. And same with the lactose, gets taken apart by lactase if the patient has lactase. And then the monosaccharides get taken in. And check it out. Remember the SGLT2 transporter in the kidney? Well, here's the SGLT1 transporter, and it's working the same way. The glucose and the sodium, remember this is in the club, come on in, friend, come with me. And so we transport it that way. Same deal with the proteins. We have to hydrolyze the protein, we have to break it up with the proteases, and there's lots of different kinds of proteases. Break it up to individual amino acids, that's what can get transported. And it was, I guess it's not on this diagram, but you transport the individual amino acids this way too. And then here's the complicated story, the lipid digestion. It's a multi-step process because we're talking about fats. These are non-polar. It's mostly carbons and hydrogens. They bond, they share the electrons equally. So their bonds are not polar bonds, they're non-polar bonds. And so there's no difference, there's no poles, there's no positive and negative charges. So they do not interact well with the water, the aqueous solution, that water is polar. And so what ends up happening is the non-polar fat, they want to glom onto each other and make this great giant bubble. Well, that's what the bile salts are about. The bile salts have a hydrophobic side and they have a hydrophilic side, a non-polar and a polar side. And so they can break up these droplets into these mycels, these tiny little droplets. And by breaking things up this way, we can get the digestive enzymes lipase and colipase to like digest the stuff, cut it apart so that we can absorb it. This is, in case you come across this term again, amphipathic, that means having 2 natures. Amphi, like amphibian, which has part of its life cycle in the water and part of its life cycle on land, or like amphitheater, partly enclosed, partly outdoors. So amphipathic means polar and non-polar. That's what the bile salts are for, is for busting up those big balls of fat so that we can get our enzymes in here to digest that fat. This is an absolutely minor note, but I thought might be of interest to you. There's a medication that's not popular at all called Orlistat. And it goes by the names Ally and Xenical. Its job, this medication blocks the action of lipase enzymes. And so because it interferes with the enzyme that's supposed to break up the fat, it makes it impossible for us to absorb the fat, because we can't absorb what we cannot digest. So if we can't cut it, we can't absorb it. And so fat gets consumed and then passes right through the digestive system. It was supposed to be this great medication to help people with weight loss. They could still eat their potato chips, but then they wouldn't absorb the fat. Sorry. The problem is, if you don't absorb the fat, then the fat stays in the stool and you end up with fat in the stool, steatorrhea, which makes the stool very oily and may make the patient prone to anal leakage. That was the polite way of saying the problem. So stuff will come out of the digestive system. It's more liquid and it's harder to keep the stool in. All right, so my point about that is I want you to really appreciate that what the lipases, what these enzymes do, they have to break up the molecules. If they don't break up the molecules, we cannot absorb them. We cannot bring them into our cells and use them for anything. All right, so the bile salts, they bring the fat digestion products to the brush border, and that can get absorbed. As soon as it gets into the cell, once it's across the cell membrane, then you regenerate the thing. You regenerate the triglyceride, you regenerate the phospholipid, you remake the cholesterol esters and pass it along. It's just getting it across the cell membrane. That's why you have to bust it up. That's why you have to digest it first. All right, so that's the end of the macronutrient absorption. Now we're getting to the micronutrients. And on this slide, we're just covering some of the vitamins and specifically iron absorption. The fat-soluble vitamins are pretty easy. Those get absorbed with fat. If the person doesn't have enough fat in their diet, they're not going to be able to absorb the fat-soluble vitamins. Those are ADEC, vitamins A, D, E, and K. Let's see if somebody has a deficiency in any of these. So the vitamin D, that's going to interfere. If you don't have vitamin D, you're not going to be able to absorb calcium. If you don't have vitamin K, that's going to interfere with production of clotting factors. Then let's go to the water-soluble vitamins. Some of the Bs, most of the B vitamins, and vitamin C. Those are the water-soluble ones. And when I say most of them, because remember, vitamin B12 is that little special case. It has to bind to intrinsic factor so that it can be absorbed as a complex. And then iron is the one mineral we're going to talk about. This one is just poorly absorbed. We're just not good at it. No matter how good we are at it, the best we do is maybe 10% of what we consume, we're able to absorb. Iron, I'll remind you, iron is really hard on the body, and so we don't let it go by itself. It has to be bound to a protein to be taken anywhere. And so we have to bind it to transferrin for its trip from the gut to the bone marrow, which is where we need most of it for making the red blood cells, for making the hemoglobin. So we bind it to transferrin for that trip to the bone marrow, or if it's going to be taken to the liver for storage, because for whatever reason we have an excess of iron, then it gets taken to the liver and it gets stored in that big ferritin molecule with hundreds of other iron atoms. Moving on into other disorders, diarrhea. This is excessive fluid excretion with the feces. Children are especially at risk for dehydration. Adults are too, but children especially, because they're so little, they don't have very big reserves of fluid. And so dehydration really does a number on kids, even more than it does on adults. There's lots of different mechanisms that can lead to diarrhea. Here are the big four. First one is secretory. That means that we are pushing water out into the lumen, into the gastrointestinal tract. This can happen with infections, like for example, with cholera. The toxins of the bacterium cause the human body to push water out into the gut. And that's no matter how hard our large intestine is trying to pull water back in, it gets overwhelmed. And we just lose lots and lots and lots of water with just very watery diarrhea. And that's the case with cholera as well as with some other bacterial infections. Then the problem may not be an infection, it may be a malabsorption problem. And why that would happen is if we lose the gut surface area. For example, remember we have the villi, and then on top of that, the microvilli on the individual cells. We lose a lot of that surface. It kind of gets smoothed out. When there are autoimmune problems, like for example, with celiac disease, a patient who has celiac disease is sensitive to the proteins in some plants, gluten. And the immune system is attacking the cells because, you know, the breakdown products of gluten are present, and the immune system attacks that as if it's some kind of threat. And it ends up damaging the brush border. Well, if you lose the brush border, you lose the ability to absorb nutrients and you lose the ability to absorb water. And so the patients end up with this watery diarrhea. There's osmotic diarrhea, as in, for example, those people who are lactose intolerant, the lactose sugar stays undigested, so we can't absorb it, stays in the gut. That draws water into the gut, leading to osmotic diarrhea. And finally, inflammatory bowel diseases. Again, we end up with a loss of gut surface area. There's persistent inflammation, and we're not able to reabsorb enough of the water. And so managing the patient's fluid balance is an important part of managing these diseases. We're going to talk about 3 immune-based gut disorders. The first one we'll mention is celiac disease. So the immune protections that are supposed to be there to protect us from infection end up attacking our own cells because individuals who have celiac disease are sensitive to this partial digestion of gluten. That protein gluten starts being broken down, and the products that are produced are identified as if they are a threat, and the immune system goes after them. And so in the absence of those protein products, the patient's fine. There is no autoimmune problem. It's just when the patient consumes food that has those proteins in it, that's when the problem comes up. I would love to go into this in more detail. I have a personal story about this, and almost losing a parent to this condition before finally somebody said, she doesn't have cancer. She's just not eating bread. And unbelievable. But yeah, I'll tell you, my mom was in the hospital. I was 12 years old. I had no idea how bad things were. But my dad had the conversation with my brother about your mom may not be coming home. And it turns out it was this. And I'm amazed sometimes when we don't identify that a GI problem is as simple as change the diet, fix the problem, going to the fundamental thing that is causing the patient to react to something. All right, I'll get on my soapbox again when we talk about diabetes. let's talk inflammatory bowel disease. Again, this was an autoimmune problem. The immune system should not be attacking the body, and yet it does. And here are the two major presentations of inflammatory bowel diseases. Crohn's disease. This one, like with many autoimmune disorders, the problems come and they go, remitting, relapsing and remitting. Abdominal pain with diarrhea. With Crohn's disease, it could be anywhere from the mouth to the anus, anywhere along that course, the immune system can be attacking the cells. Because the lesions occur here and spots like this, they're referred to as skip lesions. There can be lesions all the way through. Transmural means all through the walls, all through those different layers. Remember, we covered the different layers starting at the, we went to from the outside in. All the different layers can be eaten away with the immune system. This can lead to fistulas, connections between two loops of intestine, for example, and this can complicate the care of patients. A variation on this is ulcerative colitis. This one, it's limited to the colon, but unlike this with the skip lesions, it often will affect larger areas of the colon. Only extends to the submucosa, but there's a lot more blood loss than what we see with Crohn's disease. And these disorders are managed with immunosuppressive drugs, steroids, etc., to keep the immune system knocked down. And then our last slide here, there are multiple kinds of GI cancers. As we've mentioned, there's esophageal cancer, there can be stomach cancers, there can be cancers in the small intestine, but colorectal cancers are the most common kind of GI cancers. And of all the cancers, it's the fourth most common in the US. Screenings for colorectal cancers are done annually for occult blood. What you're looking for is the presence of iron in the stool. That's why patients can't have taken an iron supplement before doing this test. But then especially by the age of 50, but earlier, if there's a family history of colorectal cancers, the patients are recommended to have colonoscopies. Now, they don't have to be done all the time, but at least every 10 years until the age of 75 or sometimes 80. And again, this goes back to the, yes, the cancers are more common as we get older, but they're slower growing and the patients may not do very well with some of the treatments that are available for colorectal cancers later in their lives. Okay, and that is all we have time for. So that's the end of the chapter on the GI tract. Hope you have a great week.